This panel will discuss the history of Chinese Muslims, Sinicization, and simultaneity in uh, and please allow me to introduce our panelists and our moderator for today. Our moderator for today is Dr. Jacqueline Armijo. She is a visiting associate professor of history at NYU Shanghai, and she has carried out extensive field work in China, primarily in Yunnan, where she has lived for 5 years, as well as in the Gulf, in the UAE, and Qatar, where she had been based for 13 years. Her research interests and publications have focused on Islam in China, the growing importance of China-Gulf relations, and their rapidly developing cultural and educational links, as well as the Chinese Muslim diaspora around the world, and China's use of education and research initiatives to strengthen regional relationships related to the Belt and Road Initiative across Asia. She has also taught at the Asia University for Women in Bangladesh, in Qatar University, in Zayed University in the UAE, and Stanford University in the States. Our interviewee today is Dr. James Frankel. He is an associate professor at the Chinese University of Hong Kong. He earned his degrees in Asian Studies and Religion from Columbia University in New York, and his expertise is in the history of Islam in China. He has authored many articles and books, and his scholarly interests lie primarily in the comparative history of ideas and religious and cultural synthesis, as he's written in his first book, Rectifying God's Name, Liu Ji's translation of monotheism and Islamic ritual law in Neo-Confucian China. And he has also recently published a book called Islam in China. He has lived in China and traveled extensively throughout Asia, Europe, and America, where his research has included work with scholars and religious leaders of diverse Muslim communities. Please welcome our moderator and our interviewee. So without further ado, I will pass on the mic to Dr. Armijo, and she will start our discussion today. Thank you.
Let's just get started. First, I want to thank you for inviting me to interview James. I am familiar with his work. I actually used his book last semester at NYU Shanghai. And of course, it'd be wonderful to be in Abu Dhabi, what allowed, but next year. So to start off, James, how would you explain how Islam was first introduced to China?
Thank you, Jackie. Well, this is quite a challenging question, in fact, which is so often asked and so often misanswered. So, you know, there is a traditional account, and then there is the historical narrative, which we have to piece together from many different fragmentary sources. The traditional account, which is conveyed in different oral and written narratives that are common among the Chinese Muslims, attribute this to an event, actually. And a lot of these accounts say that the Tang Emperor Taizong had a dream in which there was some evil force that was threatening his palace and his empire. And when he woke up, he asks his court officials, what was this dream about? And they said, well, there is this powerful evil that is going to destroy your realm unless you find this sage, this holy man who lives somewhere in the West, and that he will come and or he will be able to dispel or to repel this evil entity. And so he sent according to the legend, he sent a mission as far west as they could go, and they ended up beyond the Kunlun Mountains and beyond the beyond, and they found themselves in a desert where there was this holy man who was leading a group of people. So of course, you know, the legend kind of implies that this was the Prophet Muhammad. And they asked the Prophet Muhammad, this delegation asked the Prophet Muhammad to come to China and to work his wonders and to say his prayers. And well, anyway, he didn't go, but he sent, according to the tradition, one of his companions as an emissary, a man by the name of Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas, one of his best known companions and actually a blood relative of his cousin. And according to these narratives, Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas arrived in Guangzhou where he built a mosque in the year 627. The mosque is still there according to tradition, and then he went to Chang'an and met with the emperor, and he was given permission to remain in China with his small party, and that was the origin of Islam in China. So that's the traditional account. But of course, we have to take that with a very large dose of salt, not just a grain. And the historicity of that is clearly problematic. Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is, the timing wasn't exactly right for this emperor and for Sa'd and for the Prophet all to have aligned in that way. Not to mention that the journey would have been, almost, very, very difficult to undertake. And Sa'd ibn Abi Waqqas is known to have been in Arabia during much of this supposed historical time period. The Chinese sources say he's buried in, the Chinese Muslim sources say that he's buried in Guangzhou. There's a tomb there. We don't know who's in it. But according to the Arab tradition, his tomb was well known in Medina. He died in Medina and was buried in Medina. Not to mention that there are other accounts that his tomb is in several other countries as well, including Egypt. So, applying the principle of Occam's razor, right? The simplest answer or simplest explanation is that he probably didn't ever arrive in China. However, within a few decades after the Prophet Muhammad's death, there are records of a journey made by a delegation sent by the Caliph Uthman around the year 651, something like that. So it's not long after that, in fact, that Islam may have entered China on an official diplomatic basis. And besides that, we also know that trade, both the overland Silk Road trade through Central Asia, and then the maritime trade through the Indian Ocean, Malacca Straits, all the way to the southeastern coast of China, would have also conveyed Muslims. Muslims were carrying out this trade, both Arabs and Persians. And so Islam probably entered China at many different entry points and in different periods or over a gradual period of time until Muslims became fairly established in cities like Guangzhou and Chang'an. And, the rest, as we say, is history.
Okay, so then how did it spread to different regions of China?
Okay, fair question. So from those central hubs, like the port city of Guangzhou, and then also from inland, right? Because Muslims very well they did settle also in Chang'an. So they were represented in central China and also in southern coastal China. And for the early part of their history, they lived in foreign quarters, okay, called Fanfan. And these were places where foreign traders and merchants lived. And in the Tang Dynasty, these were very tightly restricted and they were closed. So foreigners, including the Muslims, would not have had too much contact with local Chinese residents. But in the subsequent period after the Tang Dynasty, some of these restrictions began to be loosened because Chinese Muslims living in China had now lived there for at least 4, 5, even 6 generations, many of them intermarrying with local Chinese, usually Muslim men and Chinese women, producing hybrid Chinese Muslim families. So the stigma of being foreign was gradually dissipating, and Muslims were able to move more freely. And they did begin to settle in various parts of the country. And then, during the Yuan dynasty, during the period of Mongol rule in China, the Mongols brought foreigners from various different parts of their vast empire. And many of these people were also Muslims. So there was another influx of Muslims coming in the 13th and 14th centuries. So when you combine the pre-existing Muslim communities and this new influx of Muslim migration. It was really during this period of the Yuan dynasty that Muslims began to be scattered throughout China. Some of them sent, in fact, by the imperial government to go and help open up different parts on the sort of frontier peripheries of China to Chinese rule. So Muslims ended up being dispersed throughout China.
I was curious, what role, if any, did proselytization play in this spread of Islam in China, do you think?
Well, to my knowledge, reading the historical records, the early Muslims to come to China were not there to proselytize. They were not missionaries. They were mostly merchants, some diplomats and some soldiers. So these were not professional missionaries. And their purpose in China in the earliest days was not to try to spread Islam, but to try to earn a profit. So maybe different from other religious communities that did enter China with the hope of spreading their doctrine, Muslims were content to just go about their business. So I don't think there is really any strong tradition of proselytism among Muslims coming to China. And this persisted even as Muslims became settled in China. They lived their own lives and practiced their religion, but without much concern for spreading Islam. We don't really see any kind of proselytization, to my knowledge, until around the 16th or 17th century, when some Sufi orders entered China from the west and northwest. And they started to spread their doctrine, but mostly among pre-existing Muslim communities. So the people who were converted from one form of Islam to another form influenced by these Sufi mystical doctrines and practices.
From very early on, there was also other large foreign communities of people who were followers of other religions, Hinduism, Orthodox Christianity, Judaism, Zoroastrianism. And yet, for the most part, these communities did not survive. So what do you think are the fundamental differences between other minority religious communities in China and the Muslim communities in China?
Well, it's interesting that you asked this right after the previous question, because I think one of the major differences was that Muslims were not proselytizing, whereas Buddhists and Christians and possibly Manichaeans and they were much more interested in spreading the influence of their religious traditions. So this led to a backlash, even as early as the 9th century. In the decade of the 840s of the Common Era, there was a major backlash. The so-called Huichang persecution of Buddhism, which also swept up all foreign religions. Well, I shouldn't say all, but it also included persecution of Zoroastrians, Nestorian Christians, Manichaeans. And so a lot of these communities were devastated by this persecution. Islam remained fairly unaffected, if at all. So Muslims were able to carry on. Other groups were disrupted historically. And I really do think that it was the ability of Muslims to sort of live their lives without causing much disturbance politically or socially, that enabled Muslims to just sort of peacefully integrate into Chinese society and culture over a very gradual period, or gradually over a long period. So that, to me, is one of the possible explanations for the resilience of Muslim communities, whereas other communities kind of either faded out or were wiped out.
Okay, thank you. I'd like to now switch to the issue of traditional Chinese Muslim education in China, Jingtang Jiaoyu, and when and how and why we first developed.
Okay, well, Jingtang Jiaoyu, obviously, if we translate it directly into English, it means scripture hall education. And what this refers to really is kind of curriculum that was transmitted and that was taught in local mosques in the various Muslim communities around China. And so there was this longstanding kind of tradition and process whereby local Muslims, especially young students, would be taught the basic doctrines and practices of Islam. They'd be taught how to read and recite Quran. They would have, so they would have learned a bit of Arabic, just mostly for liturgical purposes. So this was the original form of Jingtang Jiaoyu. But starting in the 16th century, during the Ming Dynasty, Muslims were quite cut off from, Muslims in China were cut off from Muslims around the world because of Ming imperial foreign policy, which was sort of isolationist and insular. So Muslims were cut off from this contact, and therefore they became increasingly assimilated into Chinese culture. Most of them spoke Chinese as their first language and really didn't have much access to teachings or writings in Arabic or Persian. And there was one notable Muslim in Shanxi province called Hu Dengzhou, who was not happy with the lack of resources or curriculum or teachers. And he made this intrepid journey to Mecca, traveling and stopping in Central Asia, picking up teachings and books along the way, which he brought back to China. And then he began teaching his own students using these materials. And gradually they started to translate these foreign Islamic books into Chinese, because most of the Muslim community were only conversant in Chinese. And most of them had been educated in the Chinese Confucian education system. So he began this process of teaching his students, and then his students continuing that process of translating Islamic teachings into Chinese, and then teaching Arabic and Persian gradually using Chinese as the language of instruction. And this is what we call Jingtang Jiaoyu in its most developed form, which is really teaching Islam in Chinese.
Have you tried to compare the development of this tradition with other Muslim minority traditions in other parts of the world?
Well, I mean, there certainly are, there is potential for comparison because, wherever Islam has traveled, it has had to sort of adapt to the local cultural and social environment. We know that most Muslims around the world do not speak Arabic as a first language. So for them even to learn how to read Quran means that they're going to have to learn a foreign language. So in that sense, the Jingtang Jiaoyu is quite similar to other situations where Islam has spread, and especially where Muslims live as a minority community, where they have to conduct their education partly in the local language, and then of course introducing foreign language of Arabic and maybe Persian or some other languages to be able to study an Islamic curriculum. So I think that's quite similar, you might say, to madrasas or to even today to Muslim schools and Muslim colleges around the world where Muslims live outside of an Arabic-speaking traditional Islamic context. So there is that similarity, yes.
Okay, so as the Jingtang continues to develop, then we have the introduction of what's known as the Han Kitab, or the Confucian Islamic scholarly. So how exactly did that develop?
Well, yes, the so-called Han Kitab, and of course, we have Arabic speakers and Chinese speakers and English speakers in our audience right now. So you can see that this is a hybrid term. Han in Chinese means Chinese. Kitab in Arabic and other Islamic languages means books. So the Han Kitab is a canon or a genre or body of literature that we might simply describe as books about Islam in Chinese. And the Han Kitab was a direct outgrowth of the Jingtang Jiaoyu Chinese Islamic education system. Remember, I mentioned Hu Dengzhou and his students and this project and enterprise of translating Persian and Arabic books into Chinese. That was the forerunner to the Han Kitab, that translation project, which created an entire curriculum of books for teaching about Islam in Chinese. After a couple of generations, scholars, Chinese Muslim scholars from this educational system and from this educational network, which had now spread throughout many regions in China, began to write original texts, treatises in Chinese, commentaries on the Islamic classics. And they really began to produce a body of literature that was teaching Islam, explaining Islam to Chinese speakers, both Muslims and non-Muslims, if non-Muslims chose to read this. And it explained Islam in the local language, but the philosophical and the elite language of Neo-Confucian philosophy. So here we have this melding or this synthesis of Islamic doctrine and Confucian philosophical concepts, because that was the language in which the Islamic doctrine was expressed. So over several generations, we have a whole body of literature, a corpus that contains these kind of books of several different genres and different covering different topics, from Islamic law to theology to philosophy, even Islamic history, geography, all sorts of topics covered in this Han Kitab literature.
So actually, I've thought of a question I've always wondered about. Never had a chance to ask somebody. So I'm just curious. Of course, one of my favorite hadith is and now it occurs to me, did you run across this? I mean, is this hadith mentioned in the Chinese Islamic sources?
That's really interesting, Jackie. Well, first, let's be clear about the hadith. It's a very
it's my favorite hadith. So be careful what you say.
Okay. I will be careful. I want to be fair though, and it's a beautiful hadith. But whether or not it is an authentic hadith is questionable. I mean, most of the muhaddithin say that this is a hadith, but it's a weak hadith, right? It's da'if. So obviously the idea of seeking knowledge is clearly attested in the hadith and also in the Quran. But this addition of walau fi sin, right? Even to China, if you have to travel to China to gain this knowledge, you should do it. That might have been a pious embellishment in later centuries. But we understand the meaning of it. It shows you the value of education and learning, that you should go as far, the farthest reaches of the earth. Today, we might say, well, seek knowledge, even if you have to fly to the moon to get it. So that's the hadith. But it is very well attested, and it's repeated, and I love it too. And obviously, because of our interest in Islam in China, it seems particularly apt, right, to cite this hadith. So we find it in Muslim sources outside of China, for sure. But within China, in my reading of the Han Kitab, I have never come across what I can identify as a translation of that hadith in particular. I mean, in the Han Kitab, we do see many references to the idea of traveling outside of China in order to gain knowledge, right? So it's actually inverted. Seek knowledge even beyond China would be the Chinese Muslim maxim. And there are, of course, the stories in the Han Kitab also of these great Muslim luminaries who came to China to teach the religion and the teachings of the Prophet, but not that specific hadith that I know of.
One of the well, you can keep looking, but one of the one of the dimensions of Islam in China, which has fascinated me for now, some 40 years, is the way in which not just Islam as a religion adapted to China, but also certain aesthetics, be it the calligraphy or design, like the mosque you can see able to see behind me, and other artworks. So I was wondering if you could share some examples of how these two aesthetics have blended so beautifully.
Well, it's again, you've touched upon a subject that's very near and dear to my heart as well. I've studied this Chinese Islamic art. I've collected examples of it, and I'd like to think that I know a little bit about it. And what's clear is that there have been mutual influences between Chinese culture and Islamic or Islamicate culture, and this sort of East-West intercultural exchange, which has really enriched the artistic traditions of both civilizations. So I'd like to discuss this in terms of both works of art and then also architecture. And I'd like also to identify this as kind of the material culture or the material manifestation of this kind of Chinese Islamic simultaneity, right? Being Islamic and Chinese at the same time, which is true for the people, and then also for the art that they produced or the art that they commissioned, which has elements of both. And this also is a kind of encapsulation of the entire history of how Islam spread or entered and then spread and then assimilated and naturalized in China. So if you'll indulge me, I have a few slides I'd like to share with you. So please just give me a moment. Okay, can you see my screen?
Yes.
So from the very earliest period of Islam in China, we see the artistic influences coming from Central Asia and the Middle East into China. And the Tang Dynasty in particular was a very fertile sort of, a receptive culture that was quite open to foreign fashions and trends and tastes. So if you look at this example, this is a Tang Dynasty pottery pitcher, and the form and even the motifs of it are, not just evocative, but imitative of metalware, for example, metal pitchers that you would find in Persia and in the markets of the Middle East. The other very interesting thing to note is the blue glaze. This blue glaze is made from cobalt, which was only found, it was not found in China, it was found in Central Asia. So this blue pigment also reveals something about the exchange between China and Islam. And in fact, in later periods, for example, in the Yuan and Ming and Qing dynasties, we have these famous Qinghua porcelains, the so-called Ming vase that people kind of idealize, which is white porcelain, or rather blue glaze, underglaze pigmentation on a white porcelain background. The white porcelain could only be made in China. This technology was not known or available elsewhere, but the blue pigment is from the Muslim world. And it even came to be known as Hui Hui Qing, or Islamic or Muhammadan blue. And this blue, color was used in a variety of different ways on different types of objects. This is again a late Ming, early Qing dynasty water ewer, which was produced in China and then was made for export to Muslim markets. And it's in the Islamic world where the gold, overglazed gold painting would be applied. So once again, this piece itself is a unique, is an example of a collaboration between Chinese artisans and Muslim artisans in different parts of the world. So you see that there is this mutual influence. This is one of my favorite examples. This is a writing set. And so it would contain, it has a box on the bottom for brushes. And then when you remove the cover, it's an inkstone. Okay, it's a palette for mixing ink, which is a very Chinese object. It's an object that would have been used by Chinese scholars on their desks. And if you look, it has these, so it looks like a classic Ming Dynasty blue and white porcelain. This actually comes from the Zhengde reign period of the Ming Dynasty, when a lot of these kind of Chinese Islamic works of art were created in the imperial workshops. And the inscriptions obviously were written by somebody who copied or knew how to write Arabic and Persian. The inscriptions are also apt because they talk about knowledge, they talk about scholarship, they talk about the pen, right? So this to me is kind of a paragon example of this interplay of Chinese and Islamic elite literati culture. This is another one that was exported probably to the West, to the Muslim West, with the classic sort of talismanic numerology symbols on it. This is a bronze example of a garniture set, the kind of thing you would see in a Chinese temple, right, for burning incense. But this would have been used in a mosque for burning incense. And you see it has Arabic, it has the kalima, alhamdulillah, and so on, subhanallah. And then there's this style of Chinese Muslim calligraphy which developed, which is Arabic calligraphy written with Chinese writing implements. And you can see that this was used to adorn objects beyond just calligraphy, but also to adorn works of art. And so there's this distinctive form of Chinese Islamic calligraphy called Sunni script, or Chinese script in Arabic. This is an interesting example. As you can see close up, it's a Chinese character. Oh, pardon me. It's a Chinese character, right? Shou, which is written, if you look very closely, it is made up of Arabic calligraphy. Chinese painting also influenced Islamic painting styles. So this is a Ming Dynasty painting of I guess a Taoist sage or a Buddhist monk. And look at the similarity to this Central Asian depiction of a Sufi. Okay, so Chinese artistic motifs and techniques definitely influenced Islamic art as well. But perhaps the biggest imprint of Islamic aesthetics in China is through, architecture. So this is the mosque that is supposedly built by Sa'ad ibn Abi Waqqas in the city of Guangzhou. In the background, you can see a minaret, which is clearly of Middle Eastern style. But the foreground shows that this mosque was rebuilt a number of times, and most notably in the Ming period in the 14th century, it was built in the style of Chinese imperial architecture, palace and temple architecture. And this is what we see in many mosques throughout China. But the interior, once again, we have that Sunni calligraphy in the mosque. Mm-hmm. The mosque that's behind you, Jackie, is also here. This is a mosque in Quanzhou, and it's called the Mosque of the Companions. It keeps automatically forwarding. But the point is that if you look at the portico the doorway of this mosque, it is clearly built in a Central Asian Persian style. But then, not too long after, we see mosques like this throughout the country. This is the Niujie Mosque in Beijing, the Ox Street Mosque, built in the Ming Dynasty in the Imperial Temple style. And you can see this is the minaret, nothing like a Middle Eastern minaret. These are some of the architectural details. But we also see little touches of Islamic calligraphy within the Chinese aesthetic. The main entrance looks like the entrance to a Chinese temple. But when we go inside, we see both Chinese and Islamic elements, calligraphy. Here, the mihrab is, very influenced. That blue color again associated with Islam, but also the Sunni style script, maybe a more Kufic style, and also we can see the Thalath style of calligraphy. So it's all kind of blended together to create a Chinese, specifically Chinese Islamic aesthetic. And that is my little demonstration for you today.
Oh, those were beautiful. So we have now time for questions. And we wait for questions. If there's anything else that you want to add, James, please go ahead.
Well, only that, I think that when we look at the long history of Islam in China, really almost as long as the history of Islam itself, we see this process of a transformation or an adaptation. Some people call it localization, indigenization, assimilation, or the term Sinicization of Islam. And it's really it's not there's no single event that explains how and why Islam came to China. I think we should disabuse ourselves of that way of thinking, and instead think of this as being a really long and gradual and natural process whereby Muslims became Chinese Muslims, and whereby Islam took on, very distinct local characteristics. That I guess that's the thing that I hope people will take away from this talk about the history, is that this is a dynamic, but also a very natural process that took place.
Okay, so the first question has to do with distinguishing between Muslims and Arabs, such as the Pu family, medieval China. And were these two identities interchangeable in Tang or periods?
Okay, so the Pu family, which was established first in Guangzhou, and then subsequently moved to Quanzhou in Fujian province. They claim to be descendants of a particular Arab dignitary called Abu Safar. And he was an Arab, but he was an Arab from Bukhara in Central Asia. So that means that, yeah, he was Arab. He's coming from Central Asia, from a sort of Persian cultural milieu. And he may very well have been part of the overland Silk Road trade. We're not sure, but he ended up somehow, whether directly or indirectly, in Guangzhou, in a port city. So this Pu family, the name Pu actually is derived from the word Abu. So that Bu in Abu became transliterated as Pu. So that shows you the naturalization process, whereby foreign Muslims eventually took on Chinese surnames. So this lineage definitely sees itself as coming from an Arab background. And Abu Safar himself claimed to have been a descendant of the Prophet Muhammad. So this is a very noble Arab and Muslim lineage. So in this sense, we see Islam traveling hand in hand with Arab cultural identity as well. But of course, not all of the Muslims, and probably not most of the Muslims who arrived in China were Arabs. Most of them were Persian. So Muslim identity, depending on the individual lineage or family that you ask, some will say, yes, we are of Arabic descent, we're of Arab descendants. Others will say, we don't know where our people came from, but we know that they were Muslims from Central Asia, for example. So I think, to answer this question, there is a distinct Arab identity in some of the lineages, but overall, I think that the more powerful identity was this kind of foreign Muslim identity that eventually became subsumed into this Chinese Islamic identity.
Okay. There's a question about Chinese characteristics. So Chinese characteristics is a phrase largely used in the sociological and political discourse nowadays in China. To what extent do you think the development of Islam in China is one with distinct, quote unquote, Chinese characteristics?
Well, I think the contemporary usage of this term is quite different than what I might call the historical application of this term. I mean, it really is a modern discourse that things of foreign influence or elements of foreign cultures, if they are going to fit within China, especially contemporary China, should adapt themselves to the local Chinese cultural, social, and political environment. So we can talk about socialism with Chinese characteristics, right? Socialism is a Western doctrine developed in Europe by people like Marx and Engels, but it came to be embraced in China as a political ideology. So that would be socialism with Chinese characteristics, trying to make this ideology accessible and comprehensible to the Chinese population. In some ways, you might say that the Han Kitab were, this body of literature of Islamic content expressed in the local or the indigenous Chinese Confucian idiom, is also an expression of Islam with Chinese characteristics. It was not the kind of political discourse. This was mostly a religious and cultural exchange or synthesis. But yeah, you can say that that is a sort of Sinicization or an expression of Islam with Chinese characteristics. Although there are some scholars, Western scholars, who will say that actually this was not the Sinicization of Confucianism, of Islam, but rather the Islamization of Confucianism, right? That this was a way of expressing Islam in Confucian terms that really transformed the Chinese audience as much or more than it transformed the Muslim teachings or the Islamic teachings. So, whether you call it assimilation, integration, synthesis, Sinicization, these are all different ways of trying to express the process that I was talking about, the process of Islam being intelligible to a Chinese-speaking audience. So in that regard, yes, I can say that there has been a history of Islam with Chinese characteristics, but certainly not the same application of that term as we see in the modern day political discourse.
Okay, so speaking of political discourse, next question. You've talked a lot about the process of Muslim simultaneity in Chinese society. Based on this, do you see a time when such a process could be misconceived in the modern political context?
I'm sorry, you cut out there for just a second. Could you repeat it?
Okay, you have talked about the process of simultaneity in Chinese society. Based on this, do you see a time where such a process of Sinicization could be misconceived in the modern political context?
Okay, the connection still wasn't perfect, but I think I got the question. So, so is simultaneity, can it be misconceived? in the modern political context. I assume that means in the Chinese political context. I'm assuming from the question. But, well, I don't know how it could be misconceived if people understand what scholars like myself mean by simultaneity.
Mhm.
You know, what we are referring to once again is a process whereby a diaspora community has to face the challenge of assimilating in order to survive in a foreign context, while at the same time trying to preserve distinct ethno-religious traditions that make for a traditional, in this case, Muslim identity. So these are kind of dual pressures on a diaspora community or an immigrant community, which we see all around the world wherever people have migrated from one culture to another. And so simultaneity is achieving a kind of balance or harmony between those two pressures, where one can say, yes, I am Muslim, but I am Chinese. And there's no disjuncture between those two identities. It's a kind of harmonious balance. So if people misconceive that, then that just means that I guess scholars like myself have not done our best to express what we mean by it. But that's certainly what I mean by simultaneity when I use the term.
Excellent. Well, unfortunately, we've run out of time. Before I got to ask you what you thought about the fact that they named the Chinese mosque in Dubai the Huafang Qingzhense, which I assume was a play on the historical Fanfang,
Yeah.
where the foreigners had to live earlier in China.
Yeah.
So, thank you very much. This has been fun.
My pleasure. Thank you, Jackie.
Thank you, Professor Frankel, and thank you, Professor Aimiho, for moderating our discussion today. So our next session will be a panel discussion on climate and sustainability, prospects on climate policy and sustainable development. This will happen shortly at 4 to 5:30 p.m. GST, as well as 8 to 9:30 CST, as well as 8 to 9:30 EDT. Thank you very much and see you again.